I wasn't going to do this originally, I didn't really see the point, but it was around the time I sat through the train wreck that was Batman v Superman Dawn of DC not knowing what the fuck they're doing that I decided enough was enough. I put it to a vote on YouTube, DeviantArt and Twitter to determine which review I'd do in the off season of A Line Through Time. More so than DMC Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Solid The Phantom Pain, people wanted to hear my overly long opinion on Injustice Gods Among Us, probably because it's almost necessary to cover this game as a stepping stone before MKX, or because everyone knows most of the criticisms for the other two. Either way, here we are. I'm not as attached to the DC universe as I was to the MK universe going into MK 2011, so this isn't an expression of the betrayal and offence I felt when playing that game, but rather an expression of my disappointment at how poor a grasp these developers have on the many iconic characters of the DCU. Then again, they have such an infirm grasp on their own fucking characters, this should hardly be a surprise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the premise because that was the thing that really made me want to do this. I will be discussing the tie-in comic series as well in the later section, so I'll try to keep discussion outside of that to a minimum for those who want to read them. Okay, let's get started. Can we all just agree that alternate continuities in superhero works are largely complete trash? They're not used as a means to tell more evocative or risky stories that aren't constrained by the shackles of the main continuity, nor are they used to explore how these characters might be different in a radically different setting or how one change in the past could have completely altered a character's course in life. No, these stories expose a majority of comic book writers and readers as bloodthirsty sociopaths who get off on watching beloved established characters die. Sometimes that's the point and that can work well enough, like Days of Future Past, but why was it necessary for so many characters to die in, say, Kingdom Come or Flashpoint? It's bad enough when beloved characters are killed off for no reason in the mainline books, but these new alternate takes on the characters, who could well have just as many interesting stories told about them, simply exist to die horribly and depressingly. It brings to mind a question I ask myself when I watch This Is the End, the worst movie I have ever sat through. The film features a group of comedy actors playing themselves during the apocalypse. I ask myself the question, who is this for? Fans of these actors, presumably, I answered. So then, I replied, what fan of Jonah Hill wants to see a film where he gets raped and possessed by the devil, then set on fire and crushed to death? What fan of James Franco wants to see him get eaten alive by cannibals? Let's apply this thought experiment to a couple comic book AUs, shall we? Let's start with Future's End from DC, a potential future 5 years from the present when it was released. What fan of Wonder Woman or Supergirl wants to see them horribly transformed into monstrous cyborgs? What fan of Batwoman wants to see her turned into a vampire and killed by her sister? What fan of Black Canary wants to see her severed head being implanted into Frankenstein's chest so he can harness her sonic scream? And that's just one alternate universe, by the way. My favourite comic series of all time is Marvel's Generation X. About 4 issues in, the series was rebranded as Generation Next to tie into the Age of Apocalypse storyline. The Generation Next storyline lasted about 4 issues, and by the end of it, the entire team had been horribly murdered. I mean, who gets into a series and then wants to see all the characters die for basically no reason, because that story didn't amount to anything in the greater Age of Apocalypse storyline. It's just senseless violence for the sake of senseless violence. But those are just a few examples. Pick out a character from Marvel or DC, go on the wiki, and just browse through all the alternate versions and see how many of them actually survive. But I'm sure some of you are asking, what's the relevance of all this? Why does any of this matter? Why am I spending so much time going on this pointless tangent? Well, you see, my friends, the Injustice story is about 2 parallel universes. In the game anyway, the prequel comics focus solely on the alternate universe, which is fucking stupid. Basically, the story is about an alternate universe where Superman turns evil and becomes a tyrannical dictator, while Justice League members from another universe are summoned to help put a stop to him and the heroes that joined him. For simplicity's sake, we'll call these two the Regime universe and the Prime universe respectively. As with MK, the story is the biggest point of contention for me, but we'll save that for the story segment. I've got some other things that need discussing first. For example, the game's designs. The game has a generally more armoured aesthetic, similar to the future shown in the opening cinematic of DC Universe Online, and I really don't like it. You may say it makes sense for the heroes in the Regime universe where they're basically soldiers in a war. Okay, fair enough, but here's the problem. I'm talking specifically about the Prime universe. The classic versions of the characters were this awful looking armour with claws and muted colours and chins. My god, the chins. The designers then injustified the Injustice designs to make them more injusticier, and used those for the Regime universe, and they're almost all worse in every way. And they look so evil. There's no way anyone who genuinely saw themselves as the hero would wear something like this. And for some reason, they used the Prime designs for the comics. I get that those are the most recognisable designs since they're the defaults, the Player 1 costumes, but the game makes it clear that the Regime versions of the characters wore the Regime costumes the entire time. We see this in the opening cutscene. Did the artists of the comics not know, or not care, or did they just agree that the Regime costumes belong in a dumpster fire and refuse to draw them? But this then calls into question the validity of Green Arrow and Joker's Regime costumes, since they never get the chance to wear them because they both get killed early on. That's not to say all the designs are bad, mind. Wonder Woman, Green Arrow, and even Aquaman somehow are among the characters with really good default designs. I think the aesthetic would have worked a lot better for the Regime universe, with the Prime universe keeping the classic or New 52 looks instead. It would have made a much clearer distinction between the two universes and meant they wouldn't have had to split their creativity between two designs and keep one more subdued to indicate they're the more traditional versions of the characters. They could have really gone all in with these alternate versions while still having the classic versions on hand. But of course the obvious logical option is not used, because why the fuck would you? In addition to the story mode, which will take up the bulk of this review, there's also the challenge mode, Star Labs, which is functionally the same as the challenge tower from MK 2011, except that the challenges can be tackled in any order and each character gets a collection of them to do, as does the Red Sun universe via DLC. Another thing that makes it objectively better is that they didn't play up the idea that there was this big, super awesome, amazing unlockable for clearing every single challenge, only to then have a half-naked Wonder Woman costume. They didn't do any bullshit like that, and I applaud them for that, but then again, how much credit does one actually deserve for simply not doing something stupid? And of course, the game has the traditional arcade mode. I won't be getting into the endings because they are all shit, bar none. All I'll say is that they each follow a specific version of that character, either Prime or Regime, sometimes giving bits of insight, but mostly just setting up non-canon story that will never be followed up on and generally being depressing. None of this stuff breaks the game though. The gameplay and story are the most important aspects of the game, so let's talk about those and you'll see where I really take issue with this game. Naturally, the best place to start getting into the meat of things with a game is with the gameplay. So how is Injustice purely from its gameplay merits? It's alright. At its most basic, it's MK 2011's gameplay, but taken a few steps further as one might expect from a sequel to it, but with a few added touches made specifically for this setting. It's a standard 2D fighter with normals, specials, supers, all that stuff. How it starts to differ from MK is with its normals. Rather than 2 punches and 2 kicks, the face buttons are now for light and heavy hits, an attack designed for knocking the opponent back to activate transitions into other parts of the stage, and a character specific ability that can be a buff, a unique move, or a change of weapons. Some special moves are carried over from MK vs DCU, but it's mostly built from the ground up. Despite having a more limited range of options for normals, the gameplay does feel snappier than MK 2011, and if you can get some combos going, you feel like a total badass. However, I do have to criticise the way characters are defeated. This is going to feel like the most pointless tangent ever, but in typical fighting games, when a round ends through KO, the loser collapses onto the ground and stops moving, inferring that they are either unconscious or dead depending on the series. This isn't always the case though. Dead or Alive 4 and 5 have the character go down, then rest on their elbows, visibly exhausted and in pain from the fight. This game tries the latter, but it just looks awful. The animation doesn't start from the character being on the ground, it starts from a standing position, meaning that when you knock the opponent down, as most moves will, they bounce back into a standing position to fall down the correct way, where they're just tired out but often capable of remaining crouched, kneeling or sitting. It's like the character's jumping back to their feet to get killed in Mortal Kombat, only much worse, and it looks even worse in story fights when the character is still clearly conscious, only to then transition to cutscene where they're completely out cold. One of the brand new mechanics is the clash system, which I still have no idea how to initiate. A clash is a wager that either character can initiate where both give up a certain amount of their super gauge. The one who bets the most wins the clash and restores some of their health while the loser takes damage. If they bet the same, it's a tie and nobody gains anything. Certain pairs of characters have unique dialogue, which also changes based on who initiated the clash.
Back to Arkham.
I think not. Smile.
I am smiling.
This later evolved into the fight intros in MKX. In addition to stage transitions, stages also have a number of interactive elements like throwable objects, objects that can be thrown or blown up depending on character type, and objects that can be thrown or jumped off based on character type. There's also an ability to knock the opponent into an object in the background. I believe the general term for these interactables is pig advantage. Blocking in this game is done with the more traditional holding away when the attack connects, as opposed to MK's usual block button. There's also a button to make the character shift which way their body's facing for some reason. Rounds are also handled differently in this game, which carries over to MKX. Rather than the traditional rounds where both characters' health bars reset when one reaches 0, each character has 2 health bars which give a brief pause in the action when one empties. I'm not sure why this concept was changed, but I really don't like it. Imagine player 2's health hits 0 first. They then get player 1's health down to 0 before theirs reaches 0 again. For the final round, rather than the playing field being totally even, player 2 only has whatever health they had left, meaning they're still at a disadvantage. Emptying the opponent's health bar doesn't give you any more, so what this system does effectively is turn it into a single round match that lasts way longer than it should, but there's a break partway through to mitigate the effectiveness of supers. I'd much prefer the traditional style, but speaking of supers, like MK2011's X-ray moves, the super moves in this game are overly long, stupidly over the top moves that most opponents could never survive. Like, despite what the fanboys might say, I seriously doubt Batman can survive being punched into space and then punched back down to Earth, even with the power pills from the story. And worse, each character has exactly one, the same with intros and outros, which makes playing arcade mode incredibly repetitive, as you have to watch the same thing over and over and over and over again. Seriously, fighting game devs, give us more variety like in the olden days. Seeing the same moves, intros and outros every match can very quickly suck the fun out of a game. Stop being so damn lazy. I also can't figure out why the camera's so zoomed out. It's like the camera's from a sprite-based game, not one with 3D models. Was it to be nostalgic? To facilitate larger characters like Bane and Grundy? Was it so the player can get a clearer view of the ways they can interact with the environment? I have no idea. Sure, some of those explanations would be fair enough, but it makes the action feel less weighty and personal than I'd like. But overall, the gameplay is fine. It's serviceable, it works even if it's a bit slow, and it's a definite improvement over MK2011 for what that's worth. It laid the groundwork for some clear improvements in MKX and its own sequel, which I hope will turn out good. I mean in the gameplay department. In terms of story, the sequel's fucked. As with Mortal Kombat, the story of Injustice is told over multiple character-focused chapters, with a new character being given after the exact same number of fights every time, and that character never gets to be played as again. I'm not going to separate the mode from the story this time because pretty much every single criticism I had for the mode structure in MK2011 still applies here, so I'm just going to leave a link here for a bit in case you haven't seen that or you just need a refresher. I will, however, still bring up every single fight to showcase that quite a lot of them are completely unnecessary. It's a bit less of a problem here since it helps establish the villains as dominant over the heroes who are constantly moving from place to place and still getting attacked. Well, in theory anyway, the villains still get their shit pushed in routinely, making it impossible to take them seriously. There is one notable addition to the formula here though. Occasionally the game will put the player into a short minigame before a match that can reduce one fighter's health based on the outcome. For example, Green Arrow firing at Solomon Grundy as he charges him. They're okay, but they feel a bit too gimmicky and make you wish they'd just done a simple QTE like in Soul Calibur 3. Luckily that is how this stuff is approached in MKX, so you don't need to bring it up in the comments, you smart-ass know-it-all fucks. Also, they did add the ability to replay any cutscene or fight you've passed before, and cutscenes can now be both paused and skipped, which are noteworthy improvements since you don't have to go through the entire thing every time now. It doesn't fix most of the problems, but baby steps. So let's get into the story. I want you to pay attention and look out for the following occurrences. 1. Because handicap matches were removed, every time the player character faces multiple opponents, one will be knocked down or fight someone else until the first opponent is defeated, forcibly creating one-on-one scenarios regardless of how many characters are involved. 2. When the player character and their allies come upon 2 enemies, the player will fight the first one, then the second will defeat the player's ally, forcing the player to fight them too. 3. The cutscenes always have to be choreographed in such a way that the player character starts each fight on the left and the opponent on the right. 4. Everyone not being controlled by the player is utterly useless and loses feebly at every opportunity. 5. Most chapters will have the player fight 2 opponents in one arena, then move on to the next location for 2 more fights. This also had a tendency to happen in MK 2011, but I didn't pick up on it until writing this paragraph. I guess even if you spend 4 hours ranting about a game, you're going to miss something. And 6. I'd like you to observe how well the members of the Trinity perform in combat when not being played as. That's one that'll piss some fans off when they get it. You know, for how bad Street Fighter V's actual plot is, at least the structure of the mode doesn't have any of these issues. You have to love any story that opens on a quote from a fictional character. If they're real, it's just easy to be pretentious. If they're not real, it's just silly. The intro shows the reaction to the destruction of Metropolis at the GCPD, where we see a single shot of Jim Gordon, who never appears beyond this point, making you wonder why they bothered making a character model for him. The Joker is being interrogated by Batman down the hall. If you notice the footage I'm showing being quite jittery, it's just the way the cutscenes look in the game, at least on PS4. I don't recall this being an issue on the 360, and trust me, if this was a thing back then, I'm the kind of person who'd remember that. Also, the cutscenes are notably darker than the in-engine stuff. Anyway, Superman smashes through the wall and looks ready to murder the Clown Prince of Crime. Even now, when he's supposed to be a hero, this costume makes him look totally evil. It's here that we learn Joker set off a nuke in Metropolis after dosing Clark with Scarecrow's fear toxin, making him think he was fighting Doomsday when it was really Lois Lane, who was pregnant with his child. Yeah, this game is going to get dark. The game also routinely refers to the unborn child as a boy, but the comic suggests it was a girl. I don't know why that is. Needless to say, Lois is dead, and Joker keeps taunting Clark until he puts his hand through Joker's chest, killing him. Quick question, why was the comic version of this scene way more explicit than the game made by the Mortal Kombat devs? Probably because they wanted to keep the game's age rating low to get more revenue, while the comics are made for 45-year-olds who crave senseless violence because it's the only way they can get a chubby. Following this, we jump to Elsewhere, i.e. the Prime Universe, to begin Chapter 1, Batman, because of course it's bloody Batman. He's on his way to Arkham Asylum to check on the Joker while the rest of the League deal with Lex Luthor's villain forces in both Metropolis and the Watchtower. I'm not quite sure how Lex contacted and recruited Sinestro, Ares and Doomsday to his side, nor how Doomsday gets his shit pushed in so hard. Again, they don't get the characters. Bruce is ambushed by Deathstroke, whom he dispatches handily, but this fight showcases a really odd detail with these stages. Almost every stage in the game has other heroes and villains cameoing around the arena. This is cool in arcade mode and versus mode, but in the story, it seems really out of place for Hugo Strange to stand there, watching Batman and Deathstroke duke it out from like 2 feet away, or for Martian Manhunter to float around the Watchtower not helping, then disappearing during cutscenes. It's not difficult to simply turn those cameos off for specific modes. They turned off the cameos when those characters were active in MK 2011, so why not here? Anyway, Batman teleports to the Watchtower and defeats both Bane and Lex because God forbid anyone but Batman be able to defeat a villain one-on-one. The Lex fight is preceded by the first of those awful minigames which sees Lex teleport backwards in between each segment to facilitate his continual moving forward in spite of there not being enough space for that. It's almost like this was a stupid idea. Joker and his nuke are detected in Metropolis, so the Senior Leaguers rush off to stop him, and if you're paying close attention, one major difference between the two universes is presented here. In the Regime universe, it was never suggested that the Joker was working with Lex and the other villains. In fact, given that we later learn that Regime Lex was never a villain at all, it seems Joker was working solo in that universe. He also survived the destruction of Metropolis, suggesting he was nowhere near it like his Prime counterpart was, and Fear Toxin is never brought up in the Prime version of the plan. I don't know, I just find it weird that the version where Joker didn't have the backing of half a dozen other villains was more successful. The story feels like it's supposed to be about 2 identical universes that diverge when one Superman has his one bad day, as the Joker would put it, and the other does not. However, the numerous other differences between the 2 realities don't mesh with that concept. Joker tries to trigger the nuke just as the other heroes arrive. A few of them are surrounded by strange energy, and Bruce and Joker suddenly find themselves in an altered version of Metropolis. Exactly how Batman can recognize it after it was reduced to rubble, rebuilt and redecorated, I don't know, but he beats Joker and a military force arrives to take them in. It's clear they're pursuing Batman as well as the Joker, so Bruce uses some gadgets to escape and the Joker gets away in the confusion. We then transition into Chapter 2, Green Lantern, as he, Wonder Woman, Green Arrow and Aquaman have found themselves in an equally occupied Gotham. Hal leaves to recharge his ring at Ferris Airfield while Arthur heads for Atlantis and the other two investigate Gotham. Hal arrives to find Deathstroke being tortured by Cyborg and Raven, who mention that most of the other Titans died in Metropolis. As I said earlier, there are no handicap matches this time around, so Cyborg gets knocked on his ass to facilitate a one-on-one with Raven, and then with him. After the two Titans are dealt with, Hal releases Slade, who does a Batman while Hal receives a call from Diana. He returns to Gotham where Sinestro is attacking her and Ollie. Hal arrives and Sinestro alludes to Regime Green Arrow's death. It's mentioned that the Sinestro Corps is working with the so-called One Earth government, but only two members actually appear during the game's events. Once Sinestro goes down, the other Yellow Lantern arrives. Hal Jordan. Regime Hal has concluded that fear is more powerful than willpower, which is a pretty cool way of distinguishing the two. And the game does have a green version of this costume that's available for use, even if there is no Green Lantern Sinestro costume. How? How do you miss one of the most obvious options for an alternate costume in the fucking game? But with the Yellows defeated, the three heroes retreat to evade the government forces, where they run into a Batman. Back in the Prime universe, Superman, Flash and Cyborg are working on a way to get their friends back, and enjoy it while you can, because these little bits are among the only times we get to see Superman or Cyborg that feel like the actual characters, and not some twisted Zack Snyder monstrosity. So Chapter 3 finds Aquaman arriving in Atlantis and getting caught up on the events of the past 5 years. We learn that Superman began a campaign against supervillains and took over the planet with the help of the superheroes who joined him. And we meet two of them now in the form of the Flash and Shazam, who arrive as Superman's envoys in negotiating for the integration of Atlantis into Superman's forces. The two attack and Shazam is knocked out, leaving Flash to fight Aquaman until Billy wakes up. Arthur defeats Flash, then Shazam. Hey DC, this Aquaman is a total badass and could easily turn people around on the character without turning him into Khal Drogo. You fucking idiots. The Regime version of Aquaman then arrives for a mirror match. After getting lectured on handing his army over to Superman's command, Regime Aquaman is defeated. It ain't my Atlantis. He and his guards are then frozen by Ares as he arrives, thrilled that the conflict has begun again in earnest. Even though Ares is there to assist Prime Arthur, the two fight anyway to fill the quota, with ego being the limp justification. And I hope you enjoyed having 4 fights in a row in Atlantis, because we never come back here for the rest of the story. I mean, that probably is the reason why it's 4 fights in a row, but still, come on. Ares explains that he's weak from Superman's near total elimination of conflict. Batman is the only hero still opposing Superman, as the rest are either dead or turned, and the villains are somewhat split between the two sides, as we see next chapter. So yeah, Superman leads the villains, Batman leads the heroes. Look, can we just stop with the whole Batman versus Superman thing? The bit's done. How many times are we going to see this matchup played out the same fucking way every time? It's always Batman as the good guy and Superman as the bad guy. Like, I get it. The David and Goliath concept, the mortal man versus the godlike being. We all love a good underdog story, so I get why the concept appeals to people, but it's always the same thing. Batman is always prepared and sets traps that let him win. This always just assumes Superman is a colossal retard who can't predict that Batman will be prepared and make his own preparations. And surely if Batman is always so prepared he can topple the Man of Steel with little trouble, doesn't that make Superman the underdog? Shouldn't we then be rooting for him rather than the Murray Sue ultimate smart guy Batman? At least then we'd have a protagonist we can actually like. At the very least, couldn't we have had Batman as the villain? The whole thing is set into motion by his villain. He's the one that's always riding the line, and his preparedness could justify him capturing the rest of the league's big hitters before anyone knows what's happening and keeping them imprisoned until they see things his way. Because if Superman genuinely thought he was right, he would do just that. He'd capture his former allies and try to make them see things his way. They're friends after all, and rational people don't try to burn their friends to death over disagreements. Funnily enough, it's Batman v Superman that has the best excuse for the fight between these two, because those versions don't know each other at the time. Similar stories like Civil War, Avengers vs X-Men, Civil War 2, Trinity War, they all suffer the same problem. These characters are rational adults and they have been friends for over a decade. They would not resort to violence anywhere near that quickly, but at the very least the heroes don't intentionally murder one another, usually. The problem with this whole plot really is that Superman wouldn't go down this road. Again, Batman rides the line a lot more, so he'd make more sense than the Big Blue Boy Scouts. Now, I feel that some of the heroes who join Superman could maybe be justified in their reasoning. Hal Jordan, being a military man, could be one of the ones who would be more pragmatic and see killing villains as being the better option, especially when it's just a normal human who destroyed Metropolis. And am I the only one who finds it weird that Billy Batson, the youngest of the League, actually a child/slash teen who sees the world in the most black and white terms, changes the white in his costume to black when he joins Superman, despite genuinely trusting in Superman's actions as being for the best. He's basically intentionally altered his costume to make himself look more like a bad guy. Uri sends Aquaman to Batman's base where the other three are waiting. We're introduced to a strength-enhancing pill used by Superman's forces to augment their abilities. This is the story's justification for how someone like Bruce or Ollie could go toe-to-toe with Superman, Black Adam or Doomsday. It's basically the equivalent of the power fluctuation plot device from MK vs DCU, only I have a slightly harder time believing this one. Batman enters with Lex Luthor, and as I mentioned before, this Lex was never evil, which doesn't really impact the story at all. I can only assume that the writers felt that regime Superman would never let Lex live even if he promised to turn over a new leaf, so they removed his villainous past. So instead of realising that this Superman isn't Superman and changing him back, they changed Lex fundamentally too to facilitate it. Anyway, Lex is Superman's ally but secretly leaks information to Batman and funds his insurgency. He and Bruce are the ones who brought the Prime heroes over to the regime universe because they need these four to access a weapon in the Batcave. The logic is a bit messy here. We can assume that before everything went down, Bruce had his usual fail-safes in place for the other members of the League, and this weapon was the one he had in mind for Superman. Okay, holds up so far. He then decided to set the lock to require a certain 4 other Leaguers he trusted, possibly so he couldn't use it against Superman if it was he who went bad. Okay, still holds up. But Regime Aquaman's bio makes it clear he's only recently made contact with the surface, meaning he was never a member of the League, so why is his DNA needed? It's clearly not just any 4 members, since Bruce and Lex say they've been monitoring these 4 specifically. And this can't be something Superman set up afterwards to prevent the weapon from being used because A, he doesn't know about the weapon, and B, Aquaman is just now joining up with Superman. None of this makes any sense. The game also never makes it clear if the Prime heroes travelled through time as well, or if the regime universe is just 5 years ahead naturally. And the setup isn't the present and a bad future they need to prevent, so we can rule that idea out as well, even if that might have made the story work a little better. Over in the Fortress of Solitude, Superman has a device attached to Doomsday to control him. Suppression of free will, yep, another atrocity Superman has committed. Now, you may argue that Doomsday is a mindless beast anyway, or that he's too powerful, so it's for the greater good somehow. Well, to that I say, Hawk Girl's ending and Regime bio reveal that she was brainwashed into Superman's service, though it's not specified how. Your argument is now null and void. Wonder Woman arrives in a pretty slutty dress which they may as well have made selectable seeing how they made the model. We learn that she and Clark are now an item, which is another oddity. A major part of Superman's motivation is based around his guilt over what he did to Lois, and here he is fucking another woman. He would absolutely close himself off and vow never to love again for fear of the same thing happening in the future. And of course, the Spirit of Truth, the champion of the Amazons, the single most loving person in the DCU, is totally on board with oppression, murder, and mind control. Hal then arrives to report the encounter with the Prime heroes. Superman is weirdly nonplussed to hear that Green Arrow is running around again with a doppelganger of Wonder Woman. For some reason, it's the doppelganger of Hal that gets a response from Superman. This guy's being written like he's a fucking alien. Oh wait. Back in Gotham, we resume with the Joker, who finds himself attacked by Prime Batman, but he easily knocks him over. Batman's leg is injured, but the game never really explains how, since he wasn't injured last time we saw him, and Joker doesn't kick him there.
Right in the belfry!
But Joker wins and hides as Hawkgirl and Yellow Lantern arrive to arrest Bruce. Joker is then attacked by Harley Quinn, now going by Harleen, who mistakes him for an imposter. It's worth noting that Harley is the only character in the game whose regime outfit is actually better than the Prime one, though that could just be because her Prime costume is a little bit shit. I like the green streak though, it's a nice touch. Strangely, the game presents Harley as totally dependent on the Joker, while the comics instead portray her as being totally fine without him, just having him be her motivation for working against Superman. Maybe it's because the comics were basing it on how she's portrayed in the main universe currently? I don't know, but it's just inconsistent. After a brief fight, Harley realises that it is the real Joker and happily takes him away to meet her underlings. Superman and Wonder Woman arrive at Prime Bruce's cell, where Supes immediately recognises that it's not the regime Bruce because his vitals are all wrong, whatever the hell that actually means. Clark begins his interrogation as Joker gives a speech to Harley's men at Arkham Asylum, which has been redecorated based on Joker. It's worth noting noting that this alternate version of the Asylum does still have the transitions with the other Batman villains, including Scarecrow, who has naturally been dead since year 1 when Joker killed him to obtain the fear toxin. Now one could argue, well, the stage transitions are non-canon, so that doesn't matter. But then I put it to you that Scarecrow still shows up in year 5 of the comics, and not just in like, oh, a background role where it just shows a bunch of random villains. No. Actively involved in the scene, with dialogue, and helping the other villains to fight Robin. Did no one know? Did no one realise that Scarecrow was supposed to already be dead? I mean, even if he hadn't already been established as being killed by the Joker, do you not think Superman would have tracked him down and killed him because it was his fear toxin that was used to make him kill Lois? This Superman would absolutely see Scarecrow as an accessory to murder and would fucking kill him. So how is he alive in year 5? What was going through their minds? I don't know. Also, how has Superman not found Harley yet when she's taken over Arkham Asylum? I mean, you'd think he'd have leveled the place years ago, seeing how there's no real reason to have the asylum around anymore since all the regulars there are dead. Harley and her followers have the power pills, presumably from Batman, which we see makes one immune to bullets when Superman's forces attack, led by Hawkgirl and Nightwing. Hawkgirl faces Joker first but loses due to pig advantage, followed by a dumb card throwing minigame to keep Nightwing at bay. And the big battle going on in the cutscenes completely disappears once gameplay starts. Like, just have Joker get knocked into the other room, make his way back, then get knocked right back in by Nightwing. It's not difficult. Anyway, this Nightwing has a different voice, indicating that he is not Dick Grayson, but more on that later. Just know that design and personality wise, he's basically a long-haired version of the 90s movie version of Dick. So once Nightwing goes down, Batman and the Good Leaguers show up and the villains flee. Joker is forced to tell the others that Prime Bruce was captured, so the heroes plan to free him. Now, I'm not going to harp on about the Batman is the centre of the universe thing, at least not until it gets truly obnoxious. Regime Batman locks Joker up, though we don't actually know this until much later. All we know at the time is that Batman takes him somewhere. Prime, Clark, Barry and Victor aim to modify Barry's cosmic treadmill to pull the others back. There's something a bit off about using the cosmic treadmill in a story this dour and depressing. Meanwhile, Deathstroke meets with Lex to discuss joining the insurgency, commenting how it's personal, while Batman leads the others to Wayne Manor. He reveals that Superman exposed his identity and froze his assets, explaining why he's underground. He also tells them what made Superman snap in the first place, and their responses seem intended to make the viewer feel like Superman's change of personality actually makes sense, when it really doesn't.
Superman was vulnerable, probably for the first time in his life.
Green Arrow died trying to explain that to him.
Alright, moving on.
The writing and acting are really on point here, but it's all let down by the fact that, as is often the case, they don't actually explain how Ollie died. Presumably either because the writers knew the comics would cover it, or it was a way to encourage people to read the comics to find out what happened. It also raised the question of where Black Canary is, given how she's usually Ollie's wife, and the comics reveal that she is indeed his wife in this universe. Prime story potential there, and they wasted it by leaving her out of the game. They do reference the Prime version later though, as if intentionally raising the question in the player's mind. Again, maybe it's to encourage people to read the comics. Batman departs with Aquaman to power up the Batcave while Ollie leads Hal and Diana to secure the entrance. Almost immediately Hal gets knocked out and Diana fights Killer Frost while Ollie goes up against Solomon Grundy. This minigame has Grundy get knocked back at the end of each segment, unlike Lex, which does help to not completely break immersion, but it does make me wonder why Ollie's firing Nightwolf's arrows. Artistic license or lazy reuse of assets? You make the call. We then see that Diana, a lifelong warrior from an ancient Greek civilization, cannot match Killer Frost in a sword fight. Third member of the Trinity, everybody! Jesus Christ. So after Diana's frozen to keep her out of the way, Ollie steps in to take Frost down, and you really start to realise Frost's costume here is a lot like what Storm of the X-Men usually wears, even down to that horrendous mohawk that a lot of people really like for some reason. As the heroes head into the Batcave, Superman meets with Lex to discuss methods of tracking them down. You do have to wonder why Clark can't just hear Lex's heartbeat or observe other telltale signs to tell that he's lying, but you kinda have to assume that everyone who isn't the main character of that chapter is an incompetent boob. But really this whole thing brings to mind a simple change you could make to fix a lot of what makes this setting so bad. Lex is Superman's closest ally who isn't one of his SS officers, and he's also a double agent, right? Well, what if we replace Lex in that role with another supervillain, for example, Maxwell Lord? For the uninitiated, Maxwell Lord was a spokesperson for the League for a good number of years in the post-Crisis comic universe. He was later established as a secret supervillain in the Infinite Crisis event, where he was revealed to have been using mind control powers to keep the League ineffectual as part of his long-term plan to eliminate all superhumans on the planet. He was shown to be quite capable of controlling even Superman, leaving Wonder Woman no choice but to kill him. Now take that concept and run with it. Imagine that Max has a similar role to the comic version, a spokesperson and liaison for the League, secretly plotting to destroy them. He then arranges the nuke incident, explaining how the Joker got the thing without Lex's backing, and perhaps uses his powers in lieu of the fear toxin. He then pushes Superman to be more aggressive, to invert his values and make him lose sight of who he really is. This makes his friends oppose him, leading to a superhero civil war in which one side will destroy the other and, in turn, be finished off by Max, possibly by straight up commanding the remaining heroes to kill one another. Yes, resorting to mind control to justify this does take away a lot of Superman and his followers' agency in the story, turning it from a battle of ideologies, allegedly, into a story about Max's machinations, but it's really the only way you can justify initially heroic versions of these characters going so far off the deep end. Anyway, back to what we were saddled with. Clark gives Lex data on the Prime Batman for some purpose, then ponders aloud whether the Prime universe has a Lois. Again, it's strange that he's so hung up on Lois while simultaneously in a presumably sexual relationship with Diana. Down in the cave, Regime Batman explains that the cave is lined with lead, hence why Superman couldn't find the weapon. The vault is also explained a bit more.
Neutralizing Superman was not a call I could make alone. So I put the weapon in a vault that only opens by simultaneously sampling DNA from Superman's closest allies.
Again, Aquaman is just now getting around to starting relations with not only Superman but the world at large. How is he considered to be one of Superman's closest allies? But looking back on it, I'm pretty sure Aquaman is in the comics, contradicting his bio here, so God knows. I just wish the console had used their left hand so I could make a 90s hook hand Aquaman joke. Alas, it works out fine before Regime Diana and Black Adam arrive. Black Adam attacks Prime Diana and Hal and Arthur go to back her up, while Batman does something off screen, leaving Ollie against Regime Diana. Yeah, no, that's totally how they divide up the enemy. And of course, Diana isn't even slightly moved to see her old friend again after all these years, even if he is an alternate version and her Ollie was an enemy for a time.
Our Green Arrow was just as arrogant.
Bitch. Arthur goes down easy, then everyone else tries to pull Black Adam down from the air. He then summons lightning and knocks everyone out except, conveniently, our current character, since he's the only one without a direct line on Adam.
Should have seen that coming.
Yeah.
With that pointless diversion resolved, the heroes leave to get the device repaired while Chapter 6 begins. While operating the cosmic treadmill, there's some malfunction that isn't really explained, which sends Cyborg into the other universe inside the insurgency base.
Don't know whether to pat myself on the back, kick myself in the...
It's strange to have Cyborg cut himself off before he can say arse, despite having no issue having Ollie say shit earlier on. He then overhears Lex and Deathstroke discussing taking out Superman, leading to a surprisingly natural filler fight against Deathstroke while Lex runs off to get his power suit. Here you may also notice that not every transition from cutscene to fight is the same. While most of them stick to MK's uniform method of cutting to an in-game reaction angle then panning the camera out, sometimes the reaction is part of the pre-rendered cutscene, which then cuts directly into gameplay. I don't recall that being a thing in the original release, but I could be wrong. It's distracting and sometimes you're not prepared for it. After the Lex fight, conveniently, the other heroes arrive to break things up. Superman goes to the Batcave and realises Bruce has access to kryptonite. Once Cyborg is caught up, he suggests heading home to bring reinforcements, just as Superman announces his intention to execute Prime Batman later that day. The fact that it's a trap is pretty transparent. The new plan is for Cyborg to use a hologram to pose as his counterpart and teleport from the Hall of Justice to the Watchtower, then operate the teleporters from there to get Batman in and out while Aquaman leads a diversion. Deathstroke is sent with Cyborg as backup in case things go wrong, which of course they will because we need to justify random battles somehow.
But whatever history we have with our counterparts, you and I have none.
I downloaded your history. You've tried to kill this world's titans.
Only a couple times.
Then don't expect any warm fuzzies from me.
I do actually really like this dynamic. It raised the question of whether Regime Slade's actions against the Regime Titans can be held personally by Prime Cyborg. They don't do much with it of course, but I'm glad it's there since it gives both characters something actually interesting to work with, however briefly. Catwoman arrives through the teleporter, proving that she has never looked good in purple, and him responding to her greeting tips her off that he's an imposter. It's clear Regime Cyborg would never respond happily to her, so would he normally just ignore her? Then why would she even bother greeting him? It's not like she's already suspicious because he shows no signs of that until he responds, so what exactly is it about his disinterested response that tips her off? She exposes him and chooses to fight the shiny metal man instead of calling it in because this is Netherrealm Selina, who I'll be discussing a lot more later. Once that fight's over, Regime Cyborg starts hacking Prime Cyborg and calls it in, but the transmission is intercepted by Prime Wonder Woman. The two cyborgs have a hack-off for about 30 seconds, but there's really no physical response to anything either of them does. Like, one's arm should freeze or go limp, forcing him to work with one hand to restore the arm and fight back at the same time. Hell, why wasn't this one of those mini-games? That could have been cool. But no, the hack-off ends in a stalemate and Victor beats up his counterpart like normal. That done, Slade arrives and explains it's personal because they tortured him. If you assumed when that was first mentioned that they were alluding to something more along the lines of his children being murdered by Superman's forces, you're not the only one. In a way, it's kinda disappointing that it's not, because yeah, of course it's personal when someone tortures you, so you don't need to say it multiple times. The two arrive on the Watchtower where Victor explains he can access their network now thanks to the botched hacking attempt of his counterpart.
I'm actually beginning to like you.
Slade heads off on his own mission, coming across Flash and Shazam, and yes, you spend Deathstroke's entire chapter as a version of the character without his iconic mask.
Yeah, I asked myself, what if what happened to Lois happened to Iris?
It made sense at first. Bad people got what they deserved. But now?
Barry tries to reassure Billy that Clark won't actually kill Bruce, but Billy brings up Ollie's death, which gives Barry pause. See how great it is when you get a glimmer of who these people are supposed to be? Once again, the two are easily separated thanks to a couple mines Flash blindly runs into, allowing Slade to dispatch Billy first and Barry second. And of course we see Martian Manhunter bumming around the arena despite having been dead since year one. After beating Billy, Slade heads down to the reactor. It's kinda cool getting to start a fight in an area other than the arena's default for once. Slade sets a call to blow, giving the heroes a time limit to get Batman out of there. After that, Lex sends Slade to Ferris Airfield to get some tech to re-weaponize Batman's weapon. They keep it from Batman so he doesn't get himself killed trying to use it once it's fixed, else Insurgency die with him.
Lex Luthor risking his life to save Batman. I wanna believe it.
Bruce tells Harley to have her guys keep the cops busy, but she's secretly freeing the Joker. Prime Superman and Flash are still trying to work things out, which more than anything just points out that they are the only people working on this. Where are Nightwing, Hawkgirl, Shazam? You could at least show some background models like Manhunter or this dude working on stuff in the background even if they don't speak. It makes the universe feel really small is what I'm saying. Slade arrives in the same hangar he was being tortured in earlier, which, yeah, why was he being tortured in a hangar of all places, and why is there a big important computer here? And I'm pretty sure that this is the only arena that only has one area, so then why not add an office area to the stage just for the sake of the story mode fights? Villa Frost points to a potential origin point of the dimensional transfers, i.e. the Insurgency base, but Diana acts like more of a frigid bitch than the actual ice-wielding villain because it's not concrete. Superman can fly there or Barry can run there and check it out within 5 minutes. In fact, Diana even tells Frost to send it to Flash to check it out. Die in a fire, you colossal asshole. While Frost does this, Slade sneaks in, pulls Diana away from right beside her, and ties her up with her own lasso. He's not a ninja, and she should have been able to break free of his grasp because she has super strength. While Slade fights Frost, Diana breaks out and we get a scene that's reminiscent of a scene in MK vs DCU, only Slade can still use his pistol during the fight, unlike Jax.
You were offered amnesty, Deathstroke. You should have taken it.
And missed my chance to battle Superman's rebound girl?
How dare you? I'm an Amazon.
As if being an Amazon somehow precludes her from being a rebound girl. Once Slade gets the tech, we transition into Chapter 8, Batman. Yes, you heard that right, Batman gets a second chapter. I don't give a crap that it's a regime Batman this time, that's still 2 chapters for Batman when they could have easily given us another character like Harley, or had someone like Selina defect. Aquaman leads the attack on giant sea creatures, which Superman is too stupid to realise is an obvious diversion, despite the leader of the insurgency being Batman. The other Flyers are present to engage each other while Bruce and Ollie just waltz right in with no opposition aside from Nightwing and Catwoman. Superman apparently cannot hear them when they're on the same island, and you thought him not being able to find his mother in Batman v Superman was a plot hole. Selina goes first, flirting with Bruce, who's more disinterested than ever. She explains that she joined Superman to protect Bruce, which rings kinda hollow when one considers how she acts before and after this scene. She claims to have misdirected Superman until now, but whether it's true or not is unclear. It could be that the writers failed to provide evidence, or she could just be insane, which are both honestly how this scene comes off. Since Bruce won't leave with her, Selina is a woman scorned and fights him. You can see the problems right off the... yeah. These are the same people who made Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe. In that game, DC heroes have non-fatal heroic brutalities, while MK characters and DC villains have the series' signature fatalities. Selina, bafflingly, falls into the latter group because Selina Kyle is so well known for her propensity to violently murder people. Yes, she's killed at least once in the comics, but considering Black Mask made her sister eat her husband's eyeballs, I think we can give her a pass on that one. But perhaps worse than that, her chemistry with Bruce and the sexual tension between them is completely absent. I don't believe the two characters exchange a single line of dialogue in the entire story. The two do not interact at all, even in the few scenes where they are together. And then for Injustice, it seems like they took it too far in the other direction. Here she is, as Yahtzee so eloquently put it, Batman's lovesick stalker. He also makes a great comparison between this Selina and the one from the Arkham series, a comparison made all the more apt by both versions being voiced by Grey DeLisle. Like, why would you bother going to the effort of getting an established voice actor for a character to reprise the role with a depiction that's nothing like the original? Oh wait! It's also worth noting that this isn't just a twisted alternate universe version. The Prime version is part of Luthor's plot to nuke Metropolis. Yeah, mass murder is totally something Selina would be up for. The only way she would ever be involved in something like this would be to leak information to Batman. But no, she's just evil for no fucking reason. And just to top it all off, when she does a clash with Batman, they use their generic lines. There's unique dialogue between Batman and Scorpion from Mortal Kombat, but not Bruce and friggin' Selina. How do you even do that? You know what, NetherRealm? You clearly either don't understand Selina or you just don't give a shit. You're like Zack Snyder having Jimmy Olsen get shot in the face 5 minutes in and having Dick Grayson be long dead. If you don't like her, don't fucking bother putting her in. Do not waste my time with this shit.
I have a job to do.
So do I.
God, these guys deserved a better story than this. We then learn that this Nightwing is Damian Wayne, Bruce's biological son.
You stopped being my son when you killed Dick Grayson.
Oh, and guess how much they elaborate on this and how much it gets brought up outside of this scene? Yeah, not at all. You would think the murder of the original Robin would be brought up more than once and properly explained, but nope! And in case you're wondering, in the comic we do learn what happened. In year 1, Dick Grayson, prodigy trapeze artist, original Robin and first disciple of Batman, got knocked off balance by Damian's baton and broke his neck on a stone. Truly the heroic end he was always meant to have. I have no idea what happened here, I just thought you guys might find it amusing.
You're dead to me.
We are at war with these animals.
They head into the Citadel from Half-Life 2 where they find Prime Bruce's pod. Raven then takes control of Green Arrow's body or mind, it's not clear, and Regime Bruce has an arrow catching minigame in which his counterpart's pod is conspicuously absent despite there normally being a pod there in the stage anyway. Raven then arrives in person but gets punched out by Prime Bruce because Yellow Lantern then arrives. I'm not entirely sure why we couldn't just fight Raven instead of unnaturally dragging Hal into it, but I think it's that they wanted to have every character aside from Superman be fought twice. Hal shows no remorse towards Bruce despite the history, but Bruce does say,
Superman is the enemy, Hal, not me.
Which is something, I guess. Outside, Superman easily chokes Diana out because she's fucking useless, and he then stomps Arthur and Hal. He finally notices the others escaping the facility and confronts them.
I could have prevented Metropolis, saved my family.
Crime took my family too, Clark.
You weren't the gun.
Oh, actual attempts to characterize the duo and make Superman's actions more understandable? What backwards dimension have I crossed into? They get teleported away once they're outside the building's defences and Clark heads for the watchtower as it explodes. He then hears Lex calling him out and heads back to Earth. Again, he can hear Lex's shouting from space, but he can't hear full-blown conversations and battles on the island he's currently on.
I can't.
The story jumps back 3 hours because that 15-minute chapter totally took place over 3 hours. What, did Bruce and Ollie take the stairs? This is Lex's chapter where he gets in his power suit and takes his power pill, which is good because he's immediately shot down by the Joker, reducing the suit's power. Joker wants the suit, so he sicks Harley on Lex. Joker then tries to kill her for a failure, but Lex knocks him out. Harley goes to finish Joker, but Lex talks her down. Yes, actual character development. Sadly, that seems to have been flushed down the toilet with Injustice 2.
Harley, you're losing control.
It's part of my charm.
Good job. Lex leads Black Adam and Hawkgirl into the city and shoots them both down. Hawkgirl lands at the Hall of Justice where she fights him after he tries to talk her down. After the fight, Shazam arrives to fight Lex. By the time the fight's over, Lex's suit is mostly finished and we learn that no one died in the Watchtower explosion. Makes a change. Lex calls Clark out, meaning these 4 fights also took 3 entire hours. When Lex tries to use the weapon, Shazam blasts him, giving Superman the chance to get in close and destroy the suit. He lifts Lex up with his closed fist somehow and snaps his neck. The entire event is broadcast, swaying public opinion immediately, I think. It's not really clear. I don't know, I just figured that the point where public opinion turns against the dictator would be part of the hero's plan, but it's never brought up before this point. And apparently none of these people thought Superman murdering heroes and villains and having an army at his beck and call was anything to be concerned about until he killed Lex. Shazam is saddened by the part he played in all this in a very Anakin Skywalker-ish way. Flash is up next as the villains meet to discuss events. Superman is super salty about public opinion swaying, so he decides to destroy Gotham and Metropolis, then invade the Prime Universe to conquer that as well. Now the only person in this room who has a problem with this is Billy. Flash seems to, but keeps quiet. Diana, Shayera, Hal, Victor, Raven, all totally willing to slaughter millions, if not billions of people. I'm sorry, but you can fuck right off if you expect me to buy that these monsters were ever heroes. Clark's response to Billy not being evil and trying to point out Lois wouldn't want this is to freeze Billy's mouth shut to keep him from using his powers, then heat beaming him through the skull and killing him. This scene is rather enlightening. It paints a very vivid picture of the writers over at NetherRealm. See, I know why they chose Billy specifically for this scene. Billy Batson is a 12-year-old boy. Sure, by this point he's 17 or so given the 5-year time skip, but they still chose to have Superman murder an underage boy to be super edgy, but were too cowardly to go all in, so Billy remains in adult form. It brings to mind the fact that fatalities still exist in Mortal Kombat. Oh sure, they get creative sometimes, and more than a few of them are quite cathartic to use, but they're kind of a relic. They were a cool way of showing off to your friends if you knew the code. Now with the internet and fucking purchasable easy fatality tokens, what little substance they once had is gone. They're a spectacle and nothing else. They always try to top what's been done previously, not realising that ramping it up more often than not ruins the impact. It's a transparently manipulative and childish attempt at being mature, and the horrible murder of a child is no different. And of course, no one in the scene aside from Flash shows any kind of remorse over this. They shrug it off and move on. You cannot look at this scene and honestly tell me that any real version of Superman would ever reach this point and not become immediately crippled with guilt. The other heroes, even if they didn't do it themselves, would have a similar reaction for failing to stop it. They would collectively realise how far they've fallen and seek peace with Batman so they could stop anyone else from needlessly dying. But this is NetherRealm Studios, who utterly fail every single time at keeping characters true to themselves. I am so fucking sick of grim DC. Most people are. Linkara of Atop the Fourth Wall fame once said that in his mind, Marvel heroes are people we relate to, and DC heroes are people we look up to. This was a few years ago, of course, and at the time it was kinda hard to argue against. But you look at the company now, and when the most inspiring thing the company's putting out is a universe set in World War II, I can only surmise that the people running things over there are aware of the cultural impacts of their heroes, but they don't understand it. Superman, the man of tomorrow, the quintessential superhero, is seen as boring because DC saw the significance of the character and chose to keep him as inoffensive as possible, similar to Disney with Mickey Mouse and Nintendo with Mario. If the only way you can think to make a character interesting is to take away all the qualities that make them who they are, you need to stop making important decisions and let someone who actually cares about the legacy of the character get to work adding to the character instead of taking away. I say one final time, this thing is not Superman. Man of Steel Superman is more Superman than this disrespectful edgelord. From here on, I refuse to refer to any of these characters by name. They don't deserve the titles. From this point on, they are Rebound Girl, Yellow Belly, Automaton, Trigon Seed, Mace, and Hitler. Sure, they're not the most creative names for these characters, but it's more than they fucking deserve. Christ, Grundy shows more respect for Billy than his so-called friends. Yellow Belly here even calls Billy a casualty of war, the cunt. Flash says he's done, but that's not good enough for Yellow Belly, is it? No. He tries to stop Barry, and they try to dress it up as him being concerned that Barry will be killed by Hitler for it. I'm not buying it. Barry beats him and then Grundy. On the run, he makes a detour, which is basically outright admittance that this fight is filler. He stops Sinestro from executing some deserters and fights him off. He then wastes time building a pyramid around Sinestro without any cement. Idiot. He continues to the insurgency base where he's attacked by Ollie.
My god, Ollie, is that you? In the flesh.
After the fight, Flash gets through to Ollie and he meets with the heroes to tell him Hitler's plan, leading us into Chapter 11, Wonder Woman. Finally, Diana gets to be useful for a change. Regime Batman is intent on sending the heroes home to buy them time to prepare, but Prime Bruce suggests bringing Prime Superman over and you know immediately how the game will end. Hitler's forces attack the base and Diana goes up against Bane. Diana outright asks how Bane hasn't been killed yet and all he has is that Hitler appreciates his talents. Didn't help Billy at all, did it? So in the following minigame, Bane shoots at Diana repeatedly in the chest, meaning she can deflect every shot by keeping her arms in the same position, despite Bane using an automatic weapon, meaning he's intentionally steadying the aim again to kick back himself, the retarded fucking gimp. Right as she beats Bane, Diana is whisked away to Themyscira by Ares. She claims Ares bewitched her mother once, whatever that means. I hope they're not implying some sort of seduction thing here, because Ares in the myths is Hippolyta's father, and I'm fairly sure the Greek myths are all canon to DC. I mean, New 52 Diana was fathered by Zeus, who should be her own great-grandfather, but still. After the fight, the two Batmen go to move the transporter, which seems to actually be in the Batcave, not the Insurgency base, but the game never specifies where the base actually is, but it would obviously be nowhere near Wayne Manor. Batman wouldn't be that stupid. Ares informs Diana of the Amazon army preparing to mobilise in Hitler's name.
By Aphrodite.
Yes, the goddess of love is the exact person you evoke at a time like this instead of, I don't know, Athena, who you just mentioned to Bane. Ares tells Diana to stop her counterpart so Hitler won't gain complete control just as Trigon Seed arrives, confirming that yes, she is an agent of Trigon now, having succumbed to his influence some time ago. Diana then heads off to the docks to stop the army. The docks are at the bottom of the hill Diana was just on, so how nobody noticed the 2 consecutive battles going on, I have no idea. It's also unclear where Queen Hippolyta is, but if Rebound Girl is leading the army, she's probably dead. And of course, when Diana tries talking Rebound Girl and the Amazons down, half of what she says focuses on Hitler being a man, as if that's the reason he's a psychotic murderer.
We are to temper man's aggression, not enable it.
Lessen man's rages, overcome them.
She has enabled one man to inflict his rage on an entire planet.
I don't know, I just figured that so many years after Diana first left the island, the Amazons wouldn't be so sexist anymore. And then again, it could just be bad writers falling into the trap of stereotyping the Amazons, since better writers tend to show them as at least a little more enlightened. Still, Diana does have some good words about how the Amazons are supposed to help before the fight starts, and they all disappear aside from a few who barely pay attention. If you use Diana's super move here, it makes it look like some of the Amazons have defected. It's obviously unintentional, but it's just a fun little thing I noticed. One thing I would have liked though is if Rebound Girl could only use her sword in the fight and couldn't use her lasso, while Diana could only use the lasso. You know, just a little bit of symbolism and some added challenge to round off the chapter. Diana gives a speech to the Amazons after the fight. They all just stop because she tells them to right after she just beat their leader unconscious. She then gives her speech only facing one direction, likely because they didn't want to show from behind and turning the camera would likely reveal an unmodelled area, so she keeps her back to half of them the entire time. And there's not even a big cheer once the speech is over. It just cuts to Metropolis where the regime forces are casually walking through the city with a few tanks and firing on buildings. No aircraft strangely, even though Ferris Airfield is one of their primary bases. Doomsday gets to do stuff though. Oh yeah, Superman would totally murder a bunch of innocent people like this. How does anyone like this story? Over in Gotham, the other villains are faced with the heroes arriving. Oh, and Catwoman also takes part in the sacking of Gotham because that's totally something a jewel thief would do. Down in the Batcave, Regime Bruce is adamant about sending the Prime heroes home, but Prime Bruce is having none of it, and they fight. Yes, not only does Batman get 2 full chapters, he also gets an additional fight in Diana's chapter. He doesn't take any of her fights away, but come the fuck on, this is bullshit. As if it isn't bad enough that the entire game revolves around Batman, with him being the only regime hero who isn't an accessory to mass murder, he also gets 9 fights compared to the other characters' 4, and some characters like Shazam, Hawkgirl, Nightwing and most of the villains don't even get to be played as once. He didn't steal any of Diana's fights, but he stole someone's. I'm sick of Batman and I want DC to push someone else. I don't fucking care who. It could even be a member of the Bat family like Batgirl, Batwoman or one of the Robins. I don't care, just give me something else. Prime Bruce talks Regime Bruce into letting them stay and they bring Superman over, leading into the final chapter. Straight away, Superman's talking about saving innocent people and saying he'll help fight the other villains before fighting Hitler to prevent more casualties, as well as moving his fight with Doomsday away from civilians. So evidently they did understand what Superman is when they wrote the story, they just didn't give a fuck. Yeah, that explains a lot actually. Regime Bruce even says it's good to have Superman back, so their friendship is a thing they understood and mostly ignored as well. The fight in Gotham continues and wait, they fucked up. That's not Hawkgirl's Regime costume. And if you saw the Mortal Kombat review, you know this isn't the first time they fucked up costume choice in a pre-rendered cutscene. Good job, NetherRealm. Good to know you guys are making the most of the millions of dollars being pumped into your fucking games. Superman and the Batmen arrive to break things up. Clark then fights Black Adam in a minigame where Black Adam picks up moving cars off the street and throws them at Clark, who destroys them with heat vision. I have many questions. First, why are those cars only in the minigame and not in the cutscene or the actual fight right after this? Second, why haven't these people fled from the villains massacring innocent civilians? Third, why is Superman blowing up occupied cars? What the fuck? I just got done saying how they were writing this Superman correctly, then they fucking throw this at us! And this isn't some clever subversion where you're supposed to not destroy them and take the pre-fight damage to catch the cars and prove you're a hero. Those cars still explode, although it does reduce the casualties from 46 cars full to 3, and yes, I did count them. They just got done talking about how Superman's going to reduce civilian casualties by mindlessly slaughtering civilians.
Your evil must end.
Oh, that's rich coming from you.
You leave those children alone, Zod. Oh wait, that's Superman.
You leave those children alone, Superman?
You may have expected me to use that clip for the bridge scene, but no, it's much more appropriate here. This is the good Superman. Even the heroes who aren't villains are still villains. Once Black Adam is frozen, Sinestro attacks. I'm tempted not to call him Clark either. Somehow, this makes everyone else stop fighting to watch when him showing up in the first place didn't. But like, Sinestro's been working with this guy's counterpart for the last 5 years. How does he not know that this won't work even in the slightest? Clark appears behind Sinestro, which is amusing, but Superman can't move fast enough to go unnoticed in this setting because if he could, there'd be no contest. He pulls off Sinestro's ring because that's just something he can do apparently, and he offers Hal a chance to do the same, which he does. And to his credit, Hal does seem genuinely guilt-ridden over what he's done for the remainder of his screen time. It's not much, but it's a small addition that leads us towards his possible redemption in the sequel. Back in Metropolis, stupid happens, where Regime Aquaman arrives with his all-male army, which I hope was due to laziness so they wouldn't need to make more than one model, and not because they'd then fight the Amazons and they wanted it to be men versus women. How are those orders? But what are you trying to convey? Although I guess an ultra-feminist society would have to be fluent in nonsensical babble. Superman fights Aquaman in a blatantly different location, and you realise that there's been a bizarre difficulty spike in this chapter, and it's not like the last game where it was down to Raiden having a terrible moveset. And in case you're wondering, I'm still calling Regime Aquaman by name because he has an actual reason for being so different through his alternate history, even if the comics do completely disregard that. With their leader defeated, the Atlanteans flee immediately like it's a fucking Dynasty Warriors level, probably because they're more accurately written than he is and they wanted no part of this to begin with. Clark compliments Diana and discusses search and rescue, and it's suddenly like we're playing a completely different game, one where Superman is not an arsehole. But then Doomsday attacks and Clark flies into the Fortress of Solitude to keep him away from civilians. But it's kind of hard to focus on how good that is, because there's another Doomsday in the background of the stage. It's clearly not supposed to be Regime Doomsday that they forgot to take out the background for this fight, because it much more closely resembles Prime Doomsday. Clark throws him into the Phantom Zone, which is conveniently open, before Hitler arrives. Clark lectures his doppelganger on how Lois would be afraid and disgusted with him. They have a beam struggle and Clark pummels the villain into submission. This climax, unfortunately, is fundamentally flawed. There's really only two ways this story could end and neither one is ideal. The scenario they went with, a good Superman defeating the Superman who lost his way, is the best ending thematically. However, in the broader context of the Injustice storyline, especially when one takes the 5 years of comics leading into the game into consideration, a third party showing up out of nowhere one day and just resolving everything in about 10 minutes is horribly unsatisfying. In fact, Superman's presence is kind of that within that. You know, the Insurgency is fighting this battle for 5 years, and then alternate universe Justice League shows up and they resolve the situation, but even this part of the story that's focused on them, they're doing everything until Superman shows up and deals with everything. It's fucking insane. It's crazy. Option 2 then is Regime Batman versus Regime Superman. It's another boring as fuck Batman versus Superman scenario, but at the same time, Batman is the leader of the opposition of the regime, so it's much more satisfying for someone in Bruce's position to be the one to defeat Superman. I think the only way you could make this option work better is to replace Bruce as the leader of the other side. For example, have Wonder Woman oppose Superman with Batman acting as her strategist. She could still start out agreeing with Superman, but then turn against him once she sees he's willing to kill other heroes. Or you can have Regime Batman and Prime Superman team up to fight Regime Superman together, a la MK vs DCU. The limp writing is emphasised when some of the heroes arrive, but Green Arrow isn't one of them. They really missed out there by not having Hitler confronted with anyone he's murdered at any point in the story. It really seems like the Regime Green Arrow has more of an impact on the plot than his Prime counterpart, despite being dead for the entire duration of the story. One would think the idea of this ending would be that the evil Superman gets beaten by the man he used to be / could have been, leading to him taking a good hard look at himself and realising how far he's fallen and striving to be better. He looks like he may be remorseful for a moment before saying they'll have to kill him, proving that he has learned absolutely nothing. He gets arrested and doesn't feel at all guilty over what he's done or the friends he's murdered. He just sits in his cell scowling like the truly reprehensible piece of shit he is. I just don't understand how anyone can seriously look at this guy and believe Superman could ever become this monster. And that's what makes this ending so depressing. Only 2 members of the regime have learned from this experience. None of them have seen their heroic counterparts or how far their leader has gone off the deep end and reflected on what they've allowed themselves to become, aside from Flash and Green Lantern. The rest are just still evil, proving that this world and setting are a lost cause. And this causes serious problems going into Injustice 2. Injustice 1 only works at all because we have the more traditional versions of the heroes to both serve as the example of who the regime versions are supposed to be and to illustrate how much they've changed. It's effectively like doing a story where the Justice League fight the crime syndicate from Earth 3. Going into the sequel with no indication that there'll be any alternate versions of the characters, you lose that point of comparison and you're left with false versions of the characters that will be upheld as the primary examples of who these people are, no longer presented as the bizarro versions that turned evil, but rather the real versions. And yes, I know not many people are going to think this is what the characters are supposed to be. It's just that having this be the only universe featured makes it feel more like a bad adaptation than an Elseworld story. There will be no good Superman, Wonder Woman, Hawkgirl, Cyborg, Raven. Most of the new characters will be heroes to bolster Batman's ranks as the conflict continues, proving that none of this game's story mattered in the slightest. Thanks for wasting my time, NetherRealm. And even if you try to ignore the story and just enjoy it as a DC fighting game, you get shit like this.
Batman sends a child against me?
I'm ready to level up.
Then let's see what you can do.
Wonder Woman would never talk like that. She's the spirit of truth and the ultimate warrior of love. She is not a goddamn SS officer working for Space Hitler. It would be like doing a game focused exclusively on the crime syndicate. Actually, no, because that game would have no pretenses of being about some of the most iconic and beloved superheroes to ever exist. That would be upfront about not depicting the heroes as they should be. I mean, shit, they at least tried to humanize the psycho who murders the teenage boy in cold blood to some degree. Diana's just evil because she wants to ride Superman's dick. It says a lot that she's written more out of character than a Superman who murders his friends horribly. Think about that for a minute. And she's also the worst fighter in the game, incidentally. I observed that most of the characters are fought twice over the course of the story. The only exceptions that I can think of are Shazam, Hal Jordan, and the Trinity. But I want to focus specifically on the Trinity because those are the 3 most important heroes in the DCU. Superman is only fought once because, yeah, he could only be the final boss and the only person who can really stand up to him is himself. The Prime version is never fought due to limited screen time. Batman is fought twice, but it's a different one each time. The only reason the Prime version loses is because he's already injured somehow, while Regime Batman only loses because his opponent is also Batman. Regime Wonder Woman is also fought 3 times, while the Prime version routinely gets her ass kicked over the course of the story, including, I remind you, in a sword fight with Killer fucking Frost. The only person who should be able to match Diana in a sword fight in this roster is Ares, the actual god of war. Bottom line, Wonder Woman is a terrible fighter and a psychotic bitch, while Batman and Superman are unbeatable badasses. Thanks, NetherRealm. Alternate versions of characters are fine, but in other media, like in the films, if the primary version of the character in that series or medium is inaccurate, it comes off more as a lack of understanding of the character and setting than just an alternate take on them. Once again, NetherRealm Studios produced a story that is structurally flawed and built around an actually really bad story that horribly misunderstands the core principles of its characters, and it still gets praise. I can only assume this is the case either because everyone else has rock bottom standards, or because most of the fighting games just don't even try with their stories. And again, for the idiots whose only response is, "Story doesn't matter in a fighting game," if that were the case, the developers wouldn't keep putting it in, especially with these fully fleshed out story modes that, bad story and structure aside, do generally have pretty high production values. I also have questions about the ending montage though. Who will lead the Amazons now that Rebound Girl has been deposed? What will become of Atlantis? Why is Cyborg visiting Luthor's grave when he barely knew him? Where is Deathstroke? Why couldn't he be the one visiting Luthor's grave instead? Where is Raven? Why has everyone forgotten about Billy? Why is no one visiting his grave? Why does Hitler still have his powers when he's in a specialized cell specifically designed to dampen them? So many questions that will not be answered in the sequel, I guarantee. All in all, I fucking hate Injustice. The story is terrible, the setting is dark and edgy for the sake of being dark and edgy, the characters are inconsistent, inaccurate, mere shadows of the much more interesting originals. They just exist to fight for no valid reason, and their personalities aren't taken into account when confrontations come around to force in pointless fight scenes. It's like Death Battle. In addition to the game, a series of prequel comics began releasing 3 months ahead of the game and wrapped up 5 years later. They begin with events surrounding the prologue and continue on until just before the events of the game. After the main series concluded, production began on Injustice Ground Zero, which retells the events of the game from Harley Quinn's perspective and leads into the events of the sequel. I don't want to get too into the comics, but I think they're worth discussing here since they're a major part of the game's universe and could have a huge impact on the sequel. It's evident from the start that the team behind the comic series didn't expect it to go on nearly as long as it did. It must have been a huge success, leading to what should have been maybe 6 volumes becoming double that. You see hints of Barry and Billy's problems with Superman's methods very early on, but it's barely touched upon. It's only really brought up after year 1, right near the end, so they can gain conviction in following the Despot to get them back to the place they're supposed to be at the start of the game. With how long the comic eventually went on for, it's basically eclipsed the game as the primary Injustice story, which is a shame because there were a lot of things you knew wouldn't go anywhere since they weren't brought up in the game. And when the appearance of the Green Lantern Corps or the Greek gods don't go anywhere, there's really no point in this thing existing. As I explained in the episode of A Line Through Time on prequels, the comics exist primarily to answer the question, where is X? For example, if the top Green Lantern of Earth has defected to the Yellows, where are the other Earth-based Green Lanterns? If Superman murdered Green Arrow, where is Oliver's wife, the Black Canary? Where is the Martian Manhunter? Unfortunately, the answer is almost universally dead. This is the problem with games based on superhero comics. If they're set in a universe where everyone's already established, a part of the player's mind is always asking where any given character who doesn't appear is, especially if the events that transpire have global consequences. Mortal Kombat vs DC Universe sidestepped this issue early on, with some dialogue alluding to some Shaolin Masters from the MK side going missing. No character claims credit for the disappearances, so we're led to assume that it's a byproduct of the two universes merging. Through this, any missing character like Reptile, Goro, Supergirl or Martian Manhunter, who does get name dropped, can be chalked up to the universal merging and the player's mind is put to rest. No such incident occurs in Injustice, so characters being missing just are. The obvious excuse, and I'm really surprised they didn't just go with this, is that those characters are locked up in Superman's gulags and death camps and get freed once he's defeated. However, they instead decided to have them all get killed. There are some exceptions, like a few of the Teen Titans are in the Phantom Zone and John Constantine plays everyone to get out of Dodge, but I can't see them making up the bulk of the new roster. I think one of the most prominent elements of the comic is the characters' personalities. You can tell pretty quickly that the writers from the comics have a much firmer grasp on the characters than the game writers. For instance, Catwoman is much more like the main universe Selina. She cares deeply for Bruce and tries time after time to get him to open up, which he only really does after Dick dies. Selina loves Bruce in the comics and they handled it very well. In the game, she's, well, Yahtzee said it best. But the great irony of the comic is that, at least with some characters like Selena and Barry, the writers trying to portray them more accurately was more of a detriment to the series than anything, because it leaves the comic feeling totally at odds with the game and the way it presented the characters. They did try to make the hero's downfall seem more natural, but it didn't really work all that well. There clearly wasn't any sort of grand plan for the comic, it was just a list of groups to remove from the equation in year-long arcs, leaving very little room for properly written descents for the heroes. They did also try to humanise Superman and make his unreasonable descent into Nazism more gradual, but it's still way too sudden. During the events of year 1, he savagely beats Green Arrow to death. Some of you may try to justify it as he's lost his wife and child and he thinks Ollie is trying to harm his parents, the only family he has left, so he snaps. You know what? Fine. It's still totally out of character for Superman, but it could make sense if he hits Ollie once too hard, and it could then be used as a major turning point if Clark is horrified by what he's done and is forever changed by this. But he isn't really, he just carries on as if murdering other heroes is just fine and dandy. He never really shows any remorse for his actions and goes so far as to 1. Burn his friend the Martian Manhunter to death, 2. Heat beam a hole in Black Canary's torso, almost killing her if not for Dr. Fate's intervention, 3. Send Victor Zsasz to murder Alfred Pennyworth just to hurt Bruce, 4. Mortally wound Superboy, his clone and practically son, to force the Titans to take Connor to the Phantom Zone to save his life so they can't oppose him. And that last one is right after he kills the Joker, so he's not far enough down his descent for this to seem like the logical plot progression. There is one specific incident that perfectly exemplifies the problems with both the comics existing as a prequel and the horrendously out of character actions of the cast as a whole. During a big battle in year 3, Wonder Woman battles Batwoman and Huntress. Diana wraps her lasso around Helena's throat and accidentally snaps her neck. Batwoman then beats Diana savagely. Kate later has Diana at her mercy and she decides she's not worth it. You see, this ties into the problem of characters we know are around later in the timeline being untouchable, and also perfectly illustrates how horribly inaccurate the characterization is here. If this Diana was anything like her true comic counterparts, well, for one, she'd never be in this situation to begin with. She might stick with Clark for a while to try and make him see how far he's fallen before realising he's a lost cause and joining Batman to help stop him. But if she ever killed one of her friends or allies, she would be wrought with guilt over it. She'd surrender immediately and most likely work to stop the fighting, then give up the mantle of Wonder Woman after the conflict until she is deemed by herself and her peers to be worthy of bearing the name again. And this affects Kate as well. Now, while Kate has the same moral principles as Batman and doesn't kill, that's not her reason for letting Diana go here. It's hard to look at this moment as Kate choosing, against her deepest wishes, to uphold her moral convictions. Her choice to not kill Diana here is motivated purely by the fact that Diana canonically survives into the game. It would have been better to either not allow Kate to get this close to killing her, or to rewrite the scene to emphasise Kate's morality. But on the subject of horrible murder, some deaths, one could argue, make sense for dramatic effect. I feel like most if not all of them were handled very poorly, but some of them do work, such as Sinestro murdering Jon Stewart. That makes sense. But including Bizarro just to kill him off and having Kate randomly need to sacrifice herself to complete the dimension grabbing process are massive wastes of potential, and do not make the argument that they're not in the game so they had to die. They didn't even need to exist in the comic in the first place. It could just as easily have left them out entirely and let them have their origins later in a sequel. But no, let's just kill them off randomly because that's all the story is about really. Death and misery. And also, Batgirl is in the comic and she gets to live. And don't give me any she's in the game as DLC so she has to live, because Batgirl is only DLC, not in the actual story mode. Where is she? Why doesn't she keep fighting? She doesn't look seriously injured, and even if she was, Bruce would at least mention her in the game's story. Why do other characters have to die to explain their absence if Barbara gets to live despite still being absent? Scarecrow, as mentioned earlier, is killed by the Joker in year 1, then shows up again in year 5. Brian Buccellato, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the writer from the second half of year 3 onwards, has supposedly confirmed on Twitter that the year 5 appearance is just a production oversight and is actually non-canon, but I couldn't find any proof of that. But either way, this calls into question how Scarecrow is now a playable character in Injustice 2, or at least in the mobile version. Now you could argue that we don't know for sure that Scarecrow died from Joker's attack, allowing him to survive into year 5 and then the sequel. But as I also mentioned earlier, this Superman would never let Scarecrow live after Metropolis. And another thing I mentioned earlier is that the characters use the wrong costumes in the comics. Looking at the Joker's death in the game, it's clear that the Regime Universe costumes are supposed to be worn the entire time. The only character to use their Regime costume prior to year 5 that I can recall is Hal Jordan, and that's only because of the colour switch. Superman finally changes in year 5, and Damian finally adopts the blue Nightwing suit shortly thereafter. And on a similar note, Catwoman joins Superman maybe a few hours before the game, calling everything she claimed to do for Bruce into question. At the very end of year 5, the regime characters are all separated via teleportation just as the Prime heroes arrive. There are two main problems with this. The first is that none of the regime characters bring up the teleportation at all, even though they start appearing in the game maybe a few hours afterwards. On a related note, Superman has just had an encounter with Batman and been exposed for Alfred's murder, but he just completely forgets about it and goes to fuck around with Doomsday. And the other is that they've still not changed to the regime costumes. From this it seems that they all randomly decide to change costumes at the same time, that they even have the time to do so before any of them show up on screen, that Batman's costume is worn and weathered not through years of battle, but rather as a stylistic choice like a hipster pair of pre-torn jeans, that Damian, having only recently acquired the Nightwing suit which he was very honoured to wear, decides to either modify or replace it, and also manages to grow his hair long in a matter of hours, that Cyborg managed to completely overhaul his cybernetics while simultaneously interrogating Deathstroke, that Raven manages to get completely overtaken by Trigon while simultaneously interrogating Deathstroke, or that Alfred Pennyworth's murder is exposed by Batman as being done on Superman's orders, shocking even super militant Diana, and it's never brought up again. In fact, aside from Bruce and Damian, Dick is the only member of the Bat family to get brought up in the story. Not Tim, not Alfred, not Kate, not Barbara, not Jim, none of them. The comic is supposed to answer all the questions we have, but all it really does is raise more questions and fails to properly gel with the game it leads into. Characters like Plastic Man, Black Lightning, Killer Croc and the Atom are still around, still active, but they don't get involved. Why? What the hell were they doing during these earth-shattering events? And these aren't just nitpicks, don't you dare say that. These are things the comic specifically exists to resolve. They should have just had the comic story end around 6 months prior to the start of the game to allow the myriad differences between the game and the comic to be filled in by a time skip, rather than allowing things to run up so close to the game that none of it makes any sense. And finally, the plan to bring over the alternate universe versions of the characters makes some sense in the game because that's our introduction to the story. It's the entire premise of the story, in fact. But if you start with the comics with no knowledge of the game's plot, this would seem like a total arsepull. The game can get away with not elaborating on the thought process that led to this plan, because that's not really all that important in the grand scheme of things, but in the comic, it's a very important detail because it's the focus of the climax, yet it's not really all that well justified and seems completely random, especially when the eureka moment is when Lex sees the body of Bizarro. He sees a clone of Superman and doesn't think we could clone the members of the Justice League, he thinks we should abduct Justice Leaguers from a parallel universe. Fucking what? Ultimately, the comics have put a huge limit on the future of the setting by slaughtering so many characters. Granted, this was arguably necessary to explain all the absences from the game, but they could just as easily have written around it by saying that these characters aren't all established yet, or that they were imprisoned in the gulags. So you see, there were other options, but someone made the call to be dark and edgy and have everyone die. I wonder if this story might have been better told if there was no game to limit the roster. If the comic was all there was and they could just use all the characters they wanted without having to worry about the cost or roster bloat. If so many characters wouldn't have to die just to explain their absence from the game's limited roster. If there was actual purpose to the story rather than just to make money and fill in the unnecessary backstory to an unnecessarily dark and immature game. To accompany the main game, there was a mobile release of Injustice in April 2013. If you've played WWE Immortals or the mobile version of MKX, you've basically played Injustice Mobile because they're all basically the same game but with different characters and skins. It's really not worth getting into more than one of them, so I'd suggest picking a theme and sticking to that game if they interest you. I'd personally recommend waiting for the Injustice 2 release because presumably that will get continued support furthest into the future, but then again, when has logic ever mattered to NetherRealm or DC? I'm basing this section on my experience with the MKX game, but given the similarities between them all, there really won't be much, if anything, that doesn't apply to all of them. The games feature 3-on-3 battles built around taps, strokes and properly planned use of special moves. The player begins with low tier weak characters but then unlocks new characters by completing challenges, earning card packs or buying them outright with real money. Newly added characters begin in early access where they can be bought for about 15 bloody quid, or you can just wait a couple weeks for the challenges that let you get them for free. After the challenge period is up, they enter the card packs and acquiring them is pure luck. Each battle will take a certain amount of energy from the characters used, forcing the player to either wait for them to recharge or to pay for an instant recharge. The games are freemium in case you didn't realise, so they're designed to frustrate players into paying for stuff. Rather than traditional multiplayer, players go up against other players' teams, but I'm not sure if it's standard AI or actual ghost data. I also don't know how it decides which team to go with, since at least in MKX, the player can create 3 teams. Those tied to console releases can be connected to those via a Warner Bros. Account to unlock additional content between the 2 releases, which is a real bitch in MKX, where even the complete version requires the mobile game to unlock some of the costumes. Each costume a character is given in the mobile version counts as a separate character using different moves from the console version, or even getting new moves entirely. What's most frustrating about this is that some characters still aren't included in the mobile versions, while other characters get tons of versions, like in MKX where some characters like Ferritor and Takeda aren't included, but there are about 8 versions of Scorpion, some using the exact same costume, so what the fuck is the point? Strangely, its support and content for the mobile game continues to this day, while the console version stopped getting new content with the Ultimate Edition in 2014. The costumes range from New 52 to Amekomi to Man of Steel to Blackest Night, but the mobile version goes so much deeper. It's got costumes from Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, the Arkham series, Rebirth and Injustice 2 among others. There are also obvious costumes that were bizarrely left out of the console release, like Green Lantern Sinestro and Prisoner Superman. They even have entirely new characters exclusive to this version: Darkseid, Static, Cassandra Cain, Movie Deadshot, Arkham Knight, Jessica Cruz and Wally West. Some other characters were also given CG artwork for support cards like Power Girl, the Birds of Prey and Poison Ivy. Why none of this stuff came to the console version, I don't know. I can only assume it's because NetherRealm's mobile division basically just makes new characters and costumes for the mobile games every month and that's it, while the console team likely were told to stop making new content to start work on MKX. The mobile game is pretty good, though you'll inevitably run into the issue that there's really not all that much to do in it, aside from completing challenges to unlock content in the console version, which is pure bullshit if you ask me. There's not a lot to it, but it can be a fun distraction if you're waiting for a boss or something. And at least there's no god-awful story or poor characterization to ruin the cast, so it's technically a better game in that regard.
I'm about to end this man's whole career.
In the MK 2011 review, I went in depth on a couple of scenes and explained how they could have been handled a lot better. For this game though, I'm going to go over a way you could make the overall story better, not just a specific scene. If I had full control, I'd just ignore the entire thing with the infighting and maybe go with the crime syndicate and alternate versions of the villains as heroes in a cross-dimensional battle type story. However, for this segment, I'm going to keep the basic story of a hero going bad and creating a rift in the superhero community, and change the smaller details to show how this could have been done better, hopefully. Let's begin. The story would start with the destruction of Gotham instead of Metropolis. It always bugged me that it was a Batman villain who ruined Superman's life, because God forbid anyone other than Batman villains get to do anything. Rather than the Joker, I'd say it was Ra's al Ghul or Vandal Savage. You know, someone else with much greater resources than the Joker. Batman loses a lot in the destruction of Gotham, his home, Alfred, maybe one of the Robins in the GCPD. In his grief, Batman decides enough is enough, and he kills Ra's or permanently incapacitates Savage. Like I've said before, I feel like Batman would make a lot more sense as the one to go bad, seeing how he's always riding the line, and the subject of killing villains seems to come up a lot more often with him than with Clark. Now, some might say the reason Batman vs Superman works is the underdog factor. Batman, a mere mortal, versus Superman, who is unto a god. You know, a real David and Goliath deal. But the reason Batman even has a chance against Superman is his preparedness, especially in settings with an established league where Bruce has countermeasures in place for them all. A rogue Superman is scary and dangerous, but a rogue Batman already has plans in place to stop all of the big hitters before anyone knows what's happening. So I see Superman as being the real underdog in a fight between the two. Anyway, Batman puts together a team of those willing to kill, like Red Hood or a few mercs like Deathstroke. He heads to Arkham and starts killing villains there. Some of them manage to escape, including Harley Quinn and the Joker. Some of them go to the League and tell them Batman's gone crazy and he's killing everyone at Arkham. The heroes don't believe them at first, but someone points out that Arkham escapees wouldn't go running to the League unless they had a damn good reason. Clark says he'll go meet with Bruce and find out what's going on, confident he can deal with it. He and Bruce meet and talk, and Bruce explains that yes, he has decided that supercriminals need to be executed. Superman tries to talk him down, but Batman says it's easy for Superman to say that when he can end most conflicts before they escalate that far, but Bruce is just a man and he was Gotham's top defender. The debate goes on until Bruce realises there's no getting through, so he sprays Clark with kryptonite gas and clocks him in the face with kryptonite brass knuckles, knocking him out. Bruce imprisons Clark, but not for re-education, because if the game's version of Clark genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, he wouldn't doesn't view non-compliant heroes as obstacles to be eliminated. He would instead see them as uninformed allies who insist on viewing the world in a naive black and white manner, and so Bruce here has that viewpoint. Throughout the game, rather than cutting back to Clark to show him twirling his fucking mustache, Bruce regularly visits Clark to try and talk him into joining his side, while Clark persists in holding on to his morals and urging Bruce to rediscover his. It's clear throughout that Bruce gets no enjoyment out of this and is actually incredibly guilt-ridden about the whole thing. Meanwhile, when Superman fails to check in and Flash and other heroes scope things out, it becomes clear that Batman has indeed gone rogue. So Wonder Woman gathers the League to try and talk Bruce down, or failing that, take him in. But Bruce has a lot of reinforcements, including a few less monstrous villains who agree to join Batman's new crusade, leaving the confrontation at a stalemate. As time passes, more and more heroes and villains are sucked into the conflict, some joining Batman's pragmatic faction, like maybe Hal Jordan or Green Arrow, while others join Wonder Woman's side out of a desire to remain moral guardians to the rest of the planet, or fear of being killed by Batman. Every confrontation between Diana and Bruce sees both desperately urging the other to see things from their perspective. Bruce brings up hypotheticals of Diana losing loved ones, and Diana brings up Bruce's original mission and the memory of those he did lose to the table. Fighting is always a last resort, but they notably resort to it quicker each time, until Diana finds herself wondering if her only option is to kill Bruce and vice versa, a concept neither one relishes, as opposed to Regime Superman, who immediately resorts to it every fucking time. Bruce's side kill a number of villains, and a few heroes are killed by accident or by the villains either side employs. For the most part, Diana takes villains in to give them a chance to reform, which a fair few do, while Bruce imprisons a bunch of heroes so he can try and talk them around, which works on some, like the impressionable Shazam. The rest are then released in a raid on Batman's base at the end of the story, possibly with help from the Prime heroes. The final battle sees Diana and a weakened Clark both confronting Bruce, possibly with Prime Bruce to complete the Trinity. Bruce and his followers are incarcerated, and Clark makes a point of visiting Bruce every day, even after everything Bruce did to him, after spending years in a kryptonite-laced cell, because that, my friends, is Superman. The ultimate aim of this reimagining is to attempt to keep the cast's established personalities intact, to avoid the typical Batman vs Superman scenario, to have it be someone other than Superman who goes bad for once, to reduce the number of casualties, and to create a greater sense of a rift in the superhero community rather than everyone is wrong other than Batman. These were my major issues with the game's story, and Injustice would be a much stronger product if they sought to avoid these, well, the cliches by this point from how often they're used. Is it too much to ask for a DC fighting game to give me DC heroes and DC villains instead of these horrible misinterpretations who will fight at the drop of a hat and who are total waste of the talents of the actors and character designers and everyone else involved? If Marvel has no trouble with their film and game portrayals, then why the hell is it so hard for DC to get it right? The game has an all-star voice cast consisting of a bunch of popular voices for the characters, and some play different roles. We have George Newbern reprising Superman from the DC animated universe alongside Kevin Conroy's Batman, Susan Eisenberg's Wonder Woman, Carl Lumbly's Martian Manhunter, Adam Baldwin's Hal Jordan, and Jennifer Hale's Killer Frost. Alan Tudyk, Mark Rolston, Lacey Chabert, and Dave Sobolov reprise Green Arrow, Lex Luthor, Zatanna, and Lobo from Young Justice. Harley Quinn has Tara Strong reprising from the Arkham series alongside Grady Lyle as Catwoman, Kimberly Brooks as Barbara Gordon, and Fred Tatasciore as Solomon Grundy and Bane. Richard Epcar reprises his seriously underrated Joker from MK vs DCU, Kerry Payton returns as Cyborg from Teen Titans, and Patrick Seitz reprises Scorpion from the last 3 MK games. Some others took on new roles, such as Phil Lamar as a surprisingly awesome Aquaman, and Troy Baker adds Dick Grayson to his ever-expanding list of Batman characters he's played. They even have the character voice or lines change based on skins, like Green Lantern's Jon Stewart skin gets Phil Lamar back, Green Arrow's Arrow skin has Stephen Amell doing the voice, Regime and Cyborg Superman get different voice clips, and Damian Wayne has a different voice to Dick Grayson. They did this in MK 2011 as well, where Sector and Cyrax had human and cyborg voices, while using the alternate costume for Sub-Zero, which is the Elder Sub-Zero's costume, would swap out the voice clips for his. And it's a really cool thing. It's not done very often in games, and I wish it was done more often, but when it is done, it's awesome. I can give them credit for that. Now, some of those may be wrong. I mean, lots of people still think Tara Strong is Raven when it's clearly Lani Minella, but the point I was trying to make with all this is that they put a lot of attention into the game's voice cast, and I have to wonder if this was them trying to give the fans their favourite iconic voices for the roles, or if it was just to help cover up how horrifyingly written and out of character the Regime versions are. Hell, George Newbern's evil Superman is basically just Sephiroth.
You'll have to kill me. Good to see you, Cloud.
Kinda have to wonder if he saw it and was just taking the piss. Again, you can't possibly buy that these are the same characters, and it only gets worse in the sequel without the Prime Universe as a point of reference. Consider that Injustice 2 will have Susan Eisenberg, the iconic voice of Wonder Woman from the DCAU, a bunch of animated films, and DC Universe Online, voice an evil version of Wonder Woman who is presented as the only version of Wonder Woman. All of the skins, no matter which iteration they reflect, will retain this mockery of a personality. Imagine if they did an awesome skin of Linda Carter as DLC. Could you imagine her saying this?
Batman sends a child against me?
No. But this?
You wish Amazons to be weak. There's strength in discretion.
Yeah, you could. Same with Superman, same with Green Lantern, same with Hawkgirl. But perhaps more importantly, where do you even go from here? Leaving aside the fact that regime Batman, Superman, Flash, Cyborg and Harley were all seemingly killed in Convergence, which I guarantee won't get mentioned again, this story is done. Evil Superman is defeated, Batman and the repentant heroes can rebuild, that's it. And yet, for whatever reason, there's a sequel coming out. I get why you do a sequel in terms of gameplay. People really liked it and it can be applied easily to another DC universe, preferably one that's a little more accurate. But with the story, what's the point? So far the story seems like it's going to be just the regime universe with some new threat to face, which, between the writing and recording of this section, was revealed to be Brainiac. It will not have the more traditional, accurate depictions of the characters to balance things out, which was the only reason the first game's story worked at all. The regime characters are basically the crime syndicates, but if Owlman was a hero. But let's just say for the sake of argument that I'm in the minority on the story, that the vast majority of players love the story and setting, which I assume they do given how long the comics ran for. Even if the fans really want this universe's story to continue, the comics took a scorched earth approach that all but precludes the possibility of a sequel. If you move on with just this universe, unless Resurrection becomes a major plot point through, say, the introduction of the Black Lanterns, you cannot have Green Arrow, Shazam, Huntress, Martian Manhunter, Kyle Rayner, Jon Stewart, Guy Gardner, Lex Luthor, or the fucking Joker in the roster of a DC fighting game because, surprise, they're all dead! Just about every major hero that's not in the first game's roster has been confirmed dead in this universe, meaning that you lose out on not only a good chunk of the first game's roster, but most other potential newcomers as well. You have to wonder if the reason they've been so slow to announce new characters and why almost all of the new ones relate to space is because they're struggling to come up with more characters that are both alive and easy to justify being so. I'll be curious to see how they explain the survival of the Earth-based newcomers up to now. That'll be a fucking laugh. Back when I first wrote this section in December or so, I presented a list of predictions for Injustice 2 based on the unnaturally slow release of information at the time. Between then and the recording of this in March, there's suddenly been this massive surge of information with pretty much a character a week for a while, but even though some of these predictions have been debunked since with newer information, I figure I'll just present these predictions as is and we'll see when the game comes out how much of this I ultimately got right. Supergirl will be arriving on Earth for the first time here, explaining her absence until now. Jaime Reyes will only discover the Scarab now, explaining his absence. Jessica Cruz will be selected as the new Green Lantern of Earth since Kyle, Guy and John are all dead. Hal Jordan will steal a ring or enter a new corps so he can return to Earth and redeem himself for his part in the regime. The Gorilla Grodd and Deadshot cameos in the Riker Island stage will be used to construct their backstories. The Teen Titans, having secretly been trapped in the Phantom Zone since Year 1, will return, with Tim Drake becoming playable, possibly taking up the Nightwing mantle. Superboy will likely also be playable so he can get back at Superman for what he did to him. The big threat that will unite the two factions will be either the Black Lantern Corps or Darkseid. We now know this is not the case, but there is a chance for Injustice 3. The former allows them to bring back the numerous dead characters so they can be playable again. The latter would be more likely, however, since it would tie into the Justice League film, which will feature Steppenwolf and properly set up Darkseid's role in that universe. Superman, Wonder Woman and the other loyalists will continue to be ruined by inept writers who don't understand or don't care about who these characters are and what they represent. The story will be a mess and will try not to rely on the comic story for the sake of those who didn't read them, thereby rendering them even more irrelevant, though they will keep characters who died in the comics out of the game unless the Black Lanterns are involved. Alternatively, the game will return the favour and mostly ignore the comic and contradict half of what we saw in it. DLC will include armour sets based on the current line of movies and TV shows, with the appropriate actors providing their voices whenever possible, i.e. just the shows. And finally, the story will end with Superman nobly sacrificing himself to defeat the threat after an out-of-nowhere moral turnaround at the 11th hour. I don't hate Injustice the way I do MK2011, that's a much more deeply rooted hatred. The game has its good points, some moments are well handled, the cast did a great job with the material, and most important, the fighting is good enough to warrant a continuation to build upon it. But this game's story gets a huge free pass on the DC heroes acting totally contrary to their comic counterparts, while the film versions get lambasted for it. One could argue it's because they're presented as the alternate universe Bizarro Land versions, but as I said, in the comic and the sequel where you only focus on this universe, that is no longer the case. Say what you will about Man of Steel Superman being kind of a callous arsehole murderer, but at the very least, he never subjected his close friends to horrible deaths, nor did he heat beam a 17-year-old boy through the face.
I'm Batman.
I'm Batman.
I'm Batman.
I'm Batman.
I'm Batman.